It wasn't politics or sport dominating radio talkback or talk around the water cooler today. It was Alan Moss's final paycheck as the head of the so-called millionaires factory, Macquarie Bank. The Sydney Morning Herald headline said it all. $80 million. It's off the planet. Moss payout uproar. The Prime Minister was forced to tut-tut, as politicians usually do. And even Mr Moss had the grace to acknowledge it was, quote, a very legitimate debate, even though Macquarie had just recorded yet another dazzling profit result. But a book called SUPERCAPITALISM, coincidentally due out in Australia next week, authored by one of America's most respected economists, says the problem goes much further than just the yawning salary gap between top executives and the rest. Robbert Reich, Bill Clinton's Labor Secretary in his first term as President, and now Professor of Public Policy at the University of California's Berkeley campus, argues that it is symptomatic of a bigger problem. And it's not necessarily the executives themselves to blame. It's all of us. And that democracy itself is suffering. Robbert Reich, can I ask you to begin by summarising your core argument in supercapitalism?
Simply this, that our market economy, capitalism, not only in the United States but around the world, has become so efficient at getting the goods and services people want and the returns on investment that investors want, that it is a great success. But at the same time, that intense competition that has yielded such great deals for consumers and investors has overrun politics and democracy. Every major company has fleets of lobbyists in Washington, in most capitals of the world, and it's harder and harder for people to get heard, average citizens. In other words, as consumers and investors, we're doing great, but as citizens, people who are concerned about the quality of jobs, the quality of the environment, the quality of our daily lives, we are not doing so well.
You use America's supermarket chain Walmart to demonstrate how both consumers and investors have done well out of supercapitalism, but not necessarily society as a whole.
Walmart is the representative. It is the kind of symbol of American capitalism right now. It is the biggest employer in the United States. 50 years ago, that distinction belonged to General Motors. Now, GM was paying its workers 50 years ago the equivalent of about $60 an hour in today's dollars. Walmart is paying its workers the equivalent of about $9 to $10 in today's dollars. Again, a symptom of everything that ails the American economy. Walmart has come in for a great deal of criticism. In my book, I, in some senses, defend Walmart. I say, look, the problem is not Walmart. It's not Walmart's fault. Walmart is playing by the rules. If we want different rules, then we've got to do that through legislation.
And the rule that Walmart's playing to is that it's driven prices down for consumers and dividends up for investors. Is that the heart of the matter?
Exactly right. And that's what corporations are for. They are for providing great deals to their consumers and their investors. The problem is government sets the rules of the game. If we want Walmart to do something differently, then we have to have laws that change the rules of the game. If we want our employees to have health insurance, we want our employees in America to have better wages, better salaries, then those new rules of the game have to come through the legislature, and we've got to face the trade-offs that many of those new rules would imply. Higher wages mean often higher costs to consumers.
You make a number of comparisons between what you call the not-quite golden age and today on issues like employee pensions, wages and salaries, the top executives versus the rest, and point out why. You've used Ford and Walmart as one illustration, but can you elaborate on some of those comparisons?
Well, today, look at median wages are stuck in the mud in the United States. In Australia, the median wage is going up somewhat, but relative to top executives, it's going nowhere. We are both seeing top executives in our major companies earning $20 million, $30 million, $50, $80 million a year. Well, the vast multiples of what the average employee earns. Now, I explain in economic terms why that has occurred, but even though it is understandable and explicable economically, it is socially unjustifiable.
At the same time, it seems that even if the politicians had the will to do something about it, they're powerless to do it. I mean, what do they do? Because those same executives would simply argue that it's the market rewarding success.
Well, again, it's important, and I make this point in the book, to distinguish between what's economically rational and what is socially necessary. There are certain things that are very good for consumers and investors that turn out to be terrible for society. Global warming is one of them. Widening inequality is another. Now, with regard to top executive salaries, I say let's not tell individual companies what they can and cannot do. Let's rather look at the tax system and have a higher marginal income tax on people at the very top. George Bush went in the exact opposite direction. George Bush cut taxes, marginal tax rates for people at the very top, thereby exacerbating the widening income gap in the United States.
Well, of course, because of the size of the market and because it's the world's richest market, perhaps you could do that if the politicians had the courage. But a country like Australia, Australia's top executives would simply go to top jobs overseas. If something like that was applied, and I assume that would be the case in Europe too.
Yes, and American executives, if you had too high a marginal income tax, might go abroad as well. There has to be some international cooperation on this. I think there can be. There can be ways in which top executives are subjected by international treaty, for example, to some taxes on capital gains and on income that redound to whatever country they are in. Now, if they want to go to a tax haven, let them go to a tax haven, but then they lose their citizenship. There are not too many top executives who would make that deal, I don't expect.
So when you talk about democracy being overwhelmed, what are the most powerful manifestations of that for you?
In Washington, we now have about 40,000 corporate lobbyists. We have almost an equal number of public relations professionals working for corporations, and on top of that, about 80,000 lawyers who are working for corporations. Now, the public will can almost not be expressed. Going back to taxes, recently there was a bill in Congress to reduce to actually increase the top tax rate on people who were private equity fund managers, who are now subjected to a top tax rate of only 15% because their income is treated as capital gains in the United States. Well, that's unfair. Most average Americans pay much more in taxes in terms of their tax rate than 15%. There was a bill to rectify that. What happened? A lot of those top managers, those equity fund managers, lobbied. They used their power in Congress to prevent that bill from going through. Well, that's an example, you see, of how democracy is handicapped by the power that goes with money. We've got to have, and I make a very strong case in my book, for not only campaign finance reform, but for lobbying reform, for all sorts of other innovations that will rescue democracy from the market, that will keep capitalism on one side of the Great Divide and democratic institutions on the other.
The bottom line is that if the bulk of consumers and the bulk of investors are happy with their bargains and their dividends, and they're told that the kinds of changes you're talking about will affect their cheap goods and their investments, who's going to persuade them to give up some of their good fortune for the slightly less tangible benefit of a healthy democracy?
My point is that we are not just consumers and investors. One side of our brain wants great deals as consumers and investors, but we also are citizens. In other words, we are more than just rational, self-seeking, acquisitive consumers and investors. And understanding those two lobes of the brain, if you will, understanding the tension that exists between those two sides of the brain, responding to the two sides by having a healthy democracy and creating the possibility that people can actually give voice to their citizen concerns is one of the most important aspects of public leadership. Which brings us back to the current election.
Yes, and obviously you'd be pinning your hopes that Obama could walk down that road. But what I'd suggest to you is that no matter how powerful or how valid your questions and your concerns are, isn't it the reality that those entrenched interests in Washington are so powerful that no political leader and indeed no political party could withstand their pressure?
Kerry, absolutely not. I've spent half of my adult life in Washington. If I didn't think that we could overcome the entrenched interests, I would not be an optimist. I wouldn't be continuing to be in teaching and get involved in public policy. I wouldn't be writing books about what is possible. Again and again, at least in American history, we have seen periods of time in which the pendulum swings from a kind of you're on your own philosophy in which consumers and investors and lobbyists run Washington, to periods of time in which there is a sense that we are all in it together. And national leaders, whether they be Franklin D. Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson or any number of leaders in history, have summoned the best of Americans to a higher challenge.
Robbert Reich, thanks for talking with us.
Thanks very much, Kerry.